Hello everyone, welcome to the second lecture. Today we go more in depth to the theoretical underpinnings of participatory mapping. So we talk about what public participation actually is, how it is defined, and then we discuss the role of participatory mapping approaches. You will learn to recognize and understand what are the different levels in participation and what are the core values of public participation. And then on the latter part of the lecture, we go into some theoretical aspects, and you will learn to understand the theoretical and social underpinnings to participatory mapping approaches. I hope you enjoy. Okay, let's start. On the previous lecture, you learned that stakeholder participation is very important in land use planning today in many countries, and participatory planning is the current paradigm in land use planning in general. And what is the key issue related to that is the enhancing communication and interaction between different stakeholders in order to reach good quality land use decisions that guide us to more sustainable future. What is very important to understand, though, is that participation can be done in many different ways. And now we talk about that, the different levels of participation. Often what we see here is a term participation ladder, and this was introduced by Sherry Arnstein in 1969. She wrote about citizen involvement in planning processes and came up with this idea of a ladder that you see in the figure here. And according to her idea, as we move up higher the ladder, the level of citizen participation gets stronger, so the stakeholders have more power in decision making. So this ladder frames participation in terms of power, and the bottom rung there is defined as manipulation, where participation is non-existent, and the highest rung of citizen control is on the top towards the sky, and in this stage the citizens are in the control of the whole process. Many versions of this participation ladder have been developed throughout the years. So, for example, by Carver and McCall and Reed, that are mentioned there below. One way to present this is also through the figures that are seen here now. And the lowest rung on the ladder is here on the left side, where inhabitants are informed on the decisions. So here in the figure on the left side we have the inhabitants, on the right side we have decision makers or planners, for example. And this is a very top-down approach when inhabitants are informed on the decisions that concern them. Then when we move one ladder forward, inhabitants are asked their opinions, and this is kind of consultation. So they have some kind of a voice and power, the inhabitants. The decision makers and planners are interested to hear their opinions. Then, as proceeding further, decisions are made together. So both the inhabitants and the decision makers have and share the power in this case. And then as the last rung on the ladder, inhabitants make the decisions, and this is very bottom up. So the grassroots or the citizens here have the power in the process. Of course, a good question is that what is desirable in a land use planning process? It's necessarily not this last rung where inhabitants are self-controlling the process, but maybe it's rather this third step here where the decisions are made together. But in reality, actually, quite many land use planning processes, although they would aim to have participation, it can often be restricted to this one way of flow of information where inhabitants are asked of their opinions, so they are kind of consulted. But what is important to remember when we talk about participatory planning, that it should also be a learning process. So participation should be seen as a process where all the stakeholders are able to learn and build their capacities, and this way we integrate multiple voices into the process. I touched already the topic of what level of public participation we should target in a planning process. And now we go in more depth to that. The International Association for Public Participation has published this spectrum of public participation that is useful to assist with the selection of what level of participation we are targeting in a specific process. And this spectrum is used internationally, and it's found in public participation plans around the world. And it has the same steps that were described earlier, linking to the participation ladder. So starting from informing, then consulting, involving, collaboration, and empowerment. And towards empowerment, the public's impact on the decision making is increasing. And let's look at this in more detail. So starting from inform, the goal of public participation here is to provide the public with information, and the promise to the public is simply that we will keep you informed. It's important that the information is balanced and objective, so that then the participants are able to understand the problem and alternative ways of looking at it, and opportunities and solutions. Then consult. The goal of public participation here is to obtain feedback from the public, and the promise is then that we will keep you informed, listen to and acknowledge concerns and aspirations, and provide feedback on how public input influenced the decision. Third step is involve, and the goal of public participation here is to work directly with the public. So there is a two-way of information flow in this case, from public to the decision makers, from decision makers to the public. And the promise to the public is that we will work with you to ensure that your concerns and aspirations are directly reflected in these alternatives that are developed in the process, and provide feedback of how the public input then influenced the decisions. Then collaboration is a more deeper step to involvement. So the goal of participation is to partner with the public in each aspect of the decision, including development of alternatives and identification of preferred solutions. So it's more than the involvement, and the promise to the public is that we will ask your advice and are interested in innovation and ideas coming from you, so that we can formulate good solutions, and we will incorporate your advice and recommendations into the decisions as far as possible. And then the last one, empowerment. The goal here for participation is to place the final decision making in the hands of the public. And this is very down top, as said earlier. And promise to the public simply is that we will implement what you decide. The International Association of Public Participation has also created core values for public participation, and I will now present and discuss each of these values. There are 7 core values in total. The first one is that participation should be based on the belief that those who are affected by a decision have a right to be involved in and influence the decision-making process. If you remember from the first lecture, we discussed the substantive, instrumental, and normative reasons for public participation, and this very much links to the normative reasons that we have a right to be involved if we are affected by a decision. The second core value is that participation includes the promise that the public's contribution will influence the decision. This means that participation is not only done because, for example, a land use act is claiming that it needs to be done, but the contributions that people provide should also influence the decision and the outcome that are reached in the end. The third point is that public participation, that it should promote sustainable decisions by recognizing and communicating the needs and interests of all participants, including decision makers. And this links to the substantive reasons for participation, that we are creating better quality decisions through participation of all different parties, including the decision makers who have their expert knowledge involved in the process as well. Then the fourth core value is that participation seeks out and facilitates the involvement of those who are potentially affected by or interested in a decision. In participatory processes, for example, workshops, meetings, facilitation often is a key issue, so that people are able to give their opinions and participate. But also this links to the reaching out to marginalized or silent groups in our societies, for example, immigrants, children, or elderly can be those who are not often participating in land use related decision making. The fifth core value is that we should seek out input from participants in designing how they participate. What is relevant here to mention is, for example, that not all different ways to organize participation work for everyone. So therefore it's good that there is a heterogeneity of different tools. Very common in land use planning are public meetings organized to share and collect opinions, share information and collect opinions, workshops. Some people like to attend, some not. The meetings can be, for example, inaccessible to families with children if they are organized in the evening. Then online surveys that are becoming increasingly used because they are easy to spread and easy to you can respond at any time of the day, even in the middle of the night. But there we also should remember that not everyone have the digital skills or internet connection that they have. They can participate. So we should also try to ask from the different groups of participants how and they would like to participate and what is the optimal way for them to give their opinion. Then the sixth point provides participants with the information they need to participate in a meaningful way. This is very important and means that, for example, in a process of land use planning, the decision makers, the planners, or whoever are managing the process should give to the participants information that is objective, it's clear, it's accessible, so it's easy to read, easy to understand, and so on. And then as the seventh point, we have here communicates to participants how their input affected the decision. So ultimately, in the end, a participatory planning process can often be quite long, but in the end you should communicate to the participants what actually is the decision and how their input affected the decision. And these core values are ideals, and if you have any experience of any kind of a participatory process in land use planning, you might see that all of these ideals we don't reach them necessarily, but it is the target. And what the whole list highlights is that participation should be seen as a process from the start to the end of the decision making. So we have now discussed the levels of participation and the core values of participation in general, and now we go back to the topic of participatory mapping and discuss the societal and theoretical underpinnings to participatory mapping. So let's start from this question that why participation and mapping? What is useful when we in combining these? And we could say that this participatory mapping approaches, they open up an interesting possibility to understand human environment interaction. Our everyday activities, for example, are very much place-based. Future preferences in land use or risk perception is very much place-based. It happens at specific sites in the city, or for example. And therefore the participation of local stakeholders, particularly inhabitants or interest groups or so on, is important to understand the experiences related to these interactions with our environment. So we talk about experience-based and place-based environmental practices, meanings, values, preferences for future. And only through participation it is possible to capture this knowledge from the real users and actors of an area. And it means that this local knowledge collected from the local stakeholders, we should consider it as a type of expert knowledge. So expert knowledge is often understood as something that is related to professional expertise in something, and for example then planners have a professional expertise in land use planning and planning of our cities and in other environments. So they have that specific expert knowledge. But what is important here is that we would need to understand the local knowledge from local stakeholders as one type of expert knowledge. And then when we do have the link to participatory mapping approaches, we can say that these enable the analysis and interpretation of this local knowledge in a geographical context. So we are able to collect geospatial, spatially referenced, spatially explicit data that describes the local knowledge that is created by the local stakeholders. So hence we can say that this is place-based local knowledge or spatially explicit local knowledge. And the spatial information technologies that have developed lately have the potential to increase this degree of stakeholder involvement and influence the decision-making processes. So through participatory mapping approaches, we can see that we climb up higher on the ladder of public participation. When we look at the development of participatory mapping approaches, it's also relevant to ask that is participatory mapping actually a practice or a specific method, or actually a both of these. And referring to geographer Sarah Elwood's work and argumentation, we could say that it is actually both. And there are three reasons for this. Firstly, because it is committed to explain relationships between participation and GIS. Then secondly, because it seeks to ways to facilitate participation through the use of spatial technologies, and thirdly, because it aims to expand access to spatial data and technologies for traditionally marginalized groups. So therefore, we could say that participatory mapping is practice and a method. When we look at the GIS and society agenda, we can also see that the participatory mapping approaches respond to three aspects on this agenda, namely concerns about the uneven access to GIS and digital spatial data. Then secondly, the focus on the societal and political implications of GIS, and then thirdly, the focus on the capacity of GIS to include and represent diverse forms of spatial knowledge. I continue with the key epistemological underpinnings of participatory mapping approaches. We can say that there is a realist emphasis. That means stressing the role of the structure in shaping events, assuming, for instance, that participation is more than just what we can observe, that participation is situated within and affected by social and political structures, as are also the knowledge and experience of the participants. And then, as we have this focus on process, there is also a strong realist orientation in the focus of process. And this is evident in the common goal of explaining how participation processes work, or illustrating the processes through which particular outcomes come to be. And when we think about the validation of knowledge by examining its explanatory power in practice, we see here a commitment that is rooted in pragmatist philosophies. So considering these theoretical underpinnings, the methods that are applied in participatory mapping approaches linked to a very strong mixed methods tradition. So use of multiple methods, multiple sources of evidence or analysis techniques are often seen. So we are now coming to the end of this lecture, but before finalizing, I would like to discuss the societal implications of participatory mapping approaches. So what happens to the request of participation when a strong spatial paradigm develops in the society? On the first lecture, you maybe remember we discussed the fast and slow geographic information and the mushrooming spatial data production, and that both of these actually would be good to have both fast and slow geographic information to guide us towards sustainability. And indeed, the production and use of spatially referenced data has expanded very much during the past decade, allowing this previously elitistly owned knowledge to become available to organizations and citizens. And a couple of issues that have led to this development. At EU level, we could mention, for example, the INSPIRE directive from 2007, which is an initiative to establish an infrastructure for spatial information in Europe to make spatial and geographical information more accessible and interoperable for a wide range of purposes supporting sustainable development. And this has forced then public sector organizations, for example, to openly share the data that they produce. This development has also been supported by the emergence of new devices such as mobile displays and applications. So we have Google Maps, Google Earth, OpenStreetMap. We have our mobile phones that collect data all the time, and also, for example, smart watches and so on that track our mobility. So all of these allow mapping and spatial knowledge collection to and by a very wide range of users nowadays. The mushrooming spatial knowledge production, both public and private, increases our understanding of the complex problems of climate change, environmental degradation, and urbanization, for example. Or we could rather say that we have potential to use all this spatial knowledge for those purposes, to better understand and steer our pathways to the required sustainability transformations on our planet. So citizens have increased opportunities to communicate and create geographic knowledge and present their ideas. So we could say that this advances the democratization of knowledge systems as well. So we have open source and free software today that can be used for these purposes. We have seen innovations like the voluntary geographic information data production, and for example, risk and hazard mapping has been a very important part of crisis related to crisis events across the globe, humanitarian OpenStreetMap and so on, such projects. And then we have map-based surveys that are used in participatory planning nowadays, and they have become institutionalized even in some cases. An example of that would be Finland, where many municipalities use map-based surveys, so participatory mapping approaches as an inherent part of their planning processes nowadays. And it could also be pointed out that our future is very much, and the land use planning and participatory planning is very much affected by digital tools and applications and new sociocultural practices that are developing around these. So I hope this lecture has provoked some thoughts, and I will finish now, and let's meet again on the next lecture. I forgot to mention, here are the readings. There are 2 academic papers. The McCall and Dunn takes a more wider perspective on participatory mapping approaches, and the Kahila and authors zoom into one specific public participation process in the context of a master planning process in Helsinki in Finland.